The painting arrived at Christie's King Street on a Tuesday morning in October, wrapped in climate-controlled transit cases, and accompanied by two private security specialists who looked like they took their work personally. Sophia Laurent stood in the authentication lab on the third floor, watching through the observation window as the Old Masters team prepared to unveil what the consignor claimed was a previously unknown Caravaggio. She'd been with Christie's for 3 years now. Junior authenticator, art history PhD from the Sorbonne, specialty in Italian Renaissance and Baroque. Her office was barely larger than a closet. Her salary required flatmates in Brixton. And she'd authenticated exactly 23 paintings, significant enough to warrant the kind of security presence currently filling the room below. This would be number 24, if it was real. Marcus Chen, head of Old Masters, appeared beside her. 60 years old, Chinese-British, impeccably dressed in Savile Row tailoring that suggested his compensation package was significantly better than hers. "Ready?" he asked. "The provenance documentation is incomplete. There are significant gaps." There usually are with discoveries of this magnitude. Marcus checked his Patek Philippe, the Nautilus model that retailed around £80,000. The consignor is claiming family collection, unrecorded since 1897. If it's authentic, we're looking at $45 million at auction. And if it's not, then we've wasted considerable resources on an elaborate forgery. He smiled. "That's why we have you." The painting emerged from its case like a body from a tomb. Oil on canvas, approximately 4 feet by 5 feet. The subject immediately recognizable to anyone who'd spent time with Caravaggio's work. Judith beheading Holofernes, the biblical heroine in the act of decapitation, her face serene, almost bored, while her maidservant holds the basket and the doomed general realizes his mortality 1 heartbeat too late. Sophia had seen the Caravaggio version housed in Rome's Galleria Nazionale d'Arte Antica dozens of times, had written her dissertation on Caravaggio's use of chiaroscuro and theatrical violence. This painting shared the composition, the subject, the visceral impact of the master's work. But something felt wrong. The brushwork in Judith's sleeve was too controlled. The blood splatter lacked the improvised energy Caravaggio brought to his violence. And the background, those shadows that should have swallowed half the canvas in typical Caravaggio fashion, felt staged rather than discovered. "First impressions?" Marcus asked. "I need time with it." "You have until Thursday evening at 6 for preliminary visual assessment. Call it 54 hours from now. Not full authentication, obviously. We need months for comprehensive technical analysis. But the consignor is demanding preliminary expert opinion before committing to the full process and its considerable expense." Marcus headed for the door, then paused. "If you find obvious problems in your visual examination, we walk away now and return the painting. If it looks promising enough to warrant investment in comprehensive testing, we proceed with laboratory analysis. X-ray, infrared reflectography, spectroscopy, pigment analysis, the full technical suite. The authentication committee meets Friday morning. I'll need your preliminary visual assessment by Thursday at 6. "Who's the consignor?" "Anonymous, represented by a Zurich law firm, which either means extreme discretion or extreme nervousness about provenance questions. And there's a potential buyer interested, Morrison Capital. They're considering funding the full authentication process if we move forward. Apparently, they're building an art investment portfolio. Luca Morrison is coming personally to view it Thursday afternoon at 2. The name hit her like voltage through water. 7 years. 7 years since Paris, since the summer semester she'd spent as visiting doctoral researcher at the Bibliothèque Nationale while finishing her dissertation. Since the weeks she'd spent half her time in archives and half her time in his bed, explaining her passion for Renaissance violence, while he'd listened like her words mattered more than his family's billions. 7 years since the morning she'd woken alone in his apartment with nothing but a note that said, "I'm sorry," and no explanation for why sorry was necessary. She'd defended her dissertation that fall. Spent 2 years in temporary research positions at the Courtauld Institute while publishing revised chapters in academic journals. Applied to dozens of permanent positions before Christie's finally offered her the junior authenticator role that had brought her back to London 3 years ago. 4 years between Paris and Christie's. 4 years of rebuilding a career after emotional devastation. 4 years of telling herself she was over it. Marcus was watching her. "Is that a problem?" "No." She kept her voice level. "I'll be ready." After he left, Sophia stood alone with the painting. $45 million of art history, or $45 million of brilliant fraud. 54 hours to determine which. And the man who disappeared from her life without explanation coming to view it in person. She pulled on nitrile gloves and approached the canvas. The authentication lab at Christie's was designed for this kind of scrutiny. Adjustable lighting from every angle, microscopy equipment, extensive reference libraries of authenticated works. Sophia had spent 3 years learning to read paintings the way archaeologists read excavation layers, understanding what should be present at each level of composition, what materials were available in which periods, how different artists approached the architecture of their work. Caravaggio was theatrical, impulsive. His paintings had the energy of a man who worked fast and angry, who painted from life, who used actual swords and actual models and actual violence as reference. His brushwork should feel urgent even 400 years later. This painting felt studied. She spent the afternoon documenting her initial observations, photographing under different lighting conditions, taking preliminary measurements, cross-referencing the composition against known Caravaggio works, building the foundation for either authentication or exposure. The technical equipment was impressive, but this was still just visual assessment. True authentication required laboratory analysis that took months, pigment analysis to verify historically accurate materials, X-ray fluorescence to examine paint layer composition and detect modern pigments, infrared reflectography to study underdrawing, canvas analysis to verify age-appropriate weave and preparation, craquelure pattern analysis, comparison to documented Caravaggio, brushwork under magnification. 54 hours gave her only what her trained eye could detect, which meant she needed to be very, very careful about her conclusions. By 6 p.m., the auction house had emptied to skeleton staff and security. Sophia's office phone rang. "Christie's Old Masters, Sophia Laurent speaking." "Ms. Laurent." The voice was American, female, efficient. "I'm calling on behalf of Luca Morrison regarding the Caravaggio viewing Thursday. Mr. Morrison would like to request your presence during the viewing session. The head of department usually handles high-value client viewings. Mr. Morrison specifically requested your participation. He's reviewed your published work on Caravaggio's chiaroscuro technique and believes your expertise would be valuable to the discussion." He'd read her work. The dissertation she'd written in Paris, finally published in the Journal of Renaissance Art Studies last year, after the typical academic publication lag. The work she'd done during the summer, she'd spent half her time in the Bibliothèque Nationale's print collections and half her time in his bed, explaining her passion for Renaissance violence while he'd listened like her words mattered more than his family's billions. "I'll confirm with Mr. Chen. Mr. Morrison's office will send confirmation tomorrow. The viewing is scheduled for 2 p.m. Thursday." After the call ended, Sophia sat in her closet-sized office and tried to feel nothing about the fact that Luca Morrison had read her academic publication and specifically requested her presence for a private viewing. 7 years ago, she'd been 25, brilliant, ambitious, in love for the first time with someone who seemed to understand both her mind and her body with equal intensity. The summer had felt infinite. Research in the mornings, long lunches that turned into longer afternoons, evenings in his apartment discussing art and history, and the theatrical violence of Caravaggio's compositions. Then one morning in early September, she'd woken to find him, gone, just the note. "I'm sorry." No explanation, no phone call, no response to her messages. She'd left Paris a week later, returned to her dissertation defense, tried to understand what she'd done wrong. She'd never found an answer. The weeks had become months. The wound had scarred over. She'd told herself it was just a summer affair, that she'd been naive to think it meant more, that successful men like Luca Morrison didn't actually commit to art history, doctoral students with no family wealth and uncertain career prospects. She'd finished her PhD, published her dissertation chapters, built her career one authentication at a time, moved to London, and tried to forget Paris entirely. Now he was coming to Christie's, specifically requesting her presence, acting like those 7 years of silence were irrelevant. Sophia looked at the preliminary photographs she'd taken of the painting, Judith's serene face as she killed a man who trusted her. The violence captured in oil paint 4 centuries ago, still visceral, still disturbing. Some betrayals happened quickly. Some took years to fully process. She turned off her office lights and went home to her Brixton flat share, where her roommates were arguing about whose turn it was to buy toilet paper, and the heating still wasn't working properly, despite 3 complaints to the landlord. Tomorrow, she'd continue the authentication. Thursday, she'd face Luca Morrison with professional composure, and she'd give him exactly what he'd given her 7 years ago. Nothing, no explanation, no emotion, just the careful distance of someone who'd learned that some wounds never fully healed, they just stopped bleeding. The next morning, Sophia arrived at Christie's before sunrise. The painting waited in the authentication lab, silent and patient, indifferent to whether she could solve its mysteries or not. She'd spent half the night reading her old dissertation notes, reminding herself what she knew about Caravaggio's technique. The theatrical compositions borrowed from stage drama, the use of contemporary models rather than idealized figures, the aggressive brushwork that made violence feel immediate and present, the dramatic chiaroscuro that made light and shadow feel like physical forces engaged in warfare. This painting had all those elements, but it had them like someone performing a role, not someone living it naturally. She documented more observations. The paint application in the background showed careful layering, building up darkness through multiple thin glazes. Caravaggio typically painted shadows more directly, achieving darkness through bold application rather than patient accumulation. The fabric in Judith's dress showed meticulous attention to how light revealed texture and folds. Beautiful work, sophisticated understanding of optical effects, but it felt analytical rather than intuitive, like someone who'd studied Caravaggio's fabric rendering and carefully reproduced the technique, rather than discovering it through direct observation. By midday Wednesday, she'd developed a working hypothesis. This was period work, definitely 17th century based on materials and technique, created by someone with exceptional skill and thorough knowledge of Caravaggio's methods, but not Caravaggio himself. Most likely one of the Caravaggisti, the followers and imitators who'd spread Caravaggio's dramatic style across Europe. Possibly Bartolomeo Manfredi, whose work was often confused with the masters. The composition matched Caravaggio's treatment of the same subject too closely to be independent invention. This was probably a contemporary copy, created within years of the original, still valuable, still art historically important, but worth perhaps 8 to 10 million rather than 45, a significant distinction for any potential buyer. She documented her reasoning carefully, photographed the telling details, prepared a preliminary assessment that would recommend comprehensive technical analysis before making any definitive attribution. By Thursday morning, her report was complete. Professional, thorough, non-committal enough to avoid premature judgment, but clear enough to indicate she had serious doubts about the Caravaggio attribution. At 1:30 Thursday afternoon, Marcus appeared in her office doorway. "Morrison is here. He's early. Elena is offering coffee in the private viewing room. I'll be there in 5 minutes. Sophia." Marcus's expression was thoughtful. "You don't have to do this if there's a conflict of interest I should know about." "There's no conflict. We met years ago at an academic conference. Nothing that would compromise professional judgment." It wasn't quite a lie. They had met at an academic conference in Paris where she'd been presenting early dissertation research. The fact that the conference meeting had led to 3 months of an intensely physical relationship was technically irrelevant to her ability to authenticate artwork. Marcus didn't look convinced, but he nodded. 5 minutes. Sophia checked her reflection in the small mirror behind her office door. Professional dress, minimal jewelry, hair in a neat bun. The armor of competence and controlled expertise. She picked up her preliminary assessment folder and headed for the private viewing rooms on the 2nd floor. The private viewing room was designed to make wealthy clients feel simultaneously comfortable and impressed. Original artwork on walls, tasteful furniture, perfect lighting. The painting had been installed on a museum-quality easel, positioned for optimal viewing. Luca stood in front of it, hands in the pockets of a suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary. 7 years had changed him, more composed, more controlled, the kind of confidence that came from running successful enterprises and making decisions that moved millions of dollars across international markets. But when he turned to face her, his eyes were exactly the same, dark, focused, intelligent. The eyes that had watched her explain Caravaggio's treatment of violence like her academic passion was the most fascinating thing he'd ever encountered. "Ms. Laurent," his voice was carefully neutral. "Thank you for making time. Mr. Morrison." She matched his formality exactly. "I understand you're interested in potentially funding the comprehensive authentication process. If the preliminary assessment warrants investment." Marcus performed introductions with practiced ease, then positioned himself near the window, giving them space while maintaining supervisory presence. Elena had disappeared, probably sensing the particular tension in the room that suggested complicated history beneath professional courtesy. Luca approached the painting, studying it with the kind of focused attention she remembered from Paris. He'd always looked at her work the same way, like it mattered. Like her academic expertise was genuinely valuable rather than just intellectually decorative. "What's your preliminary assessment?" he asked. "Exceptional period work, 17th century Italian school, sophisticated understanding of Caravaggio's technique. The composition, the dramatic chiaroscuro, the psychological intensity are all convincing. But you don't think it's authentic Caravaggio. I think it deserves months of comprehensive technical analysis before making any definitive attribution. Visual assessment alone is insufficient for work of this potential significance." "But your professional instinct?" Sophia met his eyes. "My professional instinct says this is very good follower work, possibly Manfredi, created by someone who understood Caravaggio's approach thoroughly enough to reproduce it convincingly. Still valuable, still art historically important. But not the master himself. Based on what evidence? The brushwork is too controlled. Caravaggio painted impulsively, discovering composition through paint application. This shows planning. The underdrawing, if confirmed through infrared reflectography, will likely reveal preliminary sketching that Caravaggio typically avoided. The paint layering in the background suggests careful building of tonal values rather than Caravaggio's more direct approach. She was aware Marcus was listening, evaluating her reasoning. This was as much performance for her supervisor as communication with potential client. "What would comprehensive authentication require?" Luca asked. 3 to 6 months minimum. Technical imaging including X-ray fluorescence and infrared reflectography. Pigment analysis to verify historically accurate materials. Canvas analysis to confirm period-appropriate preparation and weave patterns. Comparison to authenticated works under microscopic examination. Multiple expert consultations to review findings. Documentation sufficient to support attribution conclusions that will survive academic scrutiny. Cost? Approximately £200,000 to £300,000 for comprehensive analysis. That includes laboratory time, equipment access, expert consultation fees, and documentation production. Christie's standard authentication protocols. And if it proves to be follower work, not Caravaggio, then you'll own definitively authenticated 17th century Italian Baroque painting worth approximately £8 to £10 million, rather than speculative £45 million. Still significant investment value, just not the magnitude the consignor hoped. Luca was quiet for a long moment, studying the painting. Sophia watched him think, recognizing the patterns she'd learned 7 years ago. He wasn't impulsive. He gathered information, considered angles, made decisions deliberately. "I'd like to fund the comprehensive authentication," he said finally, "with specific conditions." "Mr. Chen handles funding negotiations," Sophia said quickly. "One of my conditions is that you lead the technical analysis. I'm a junior authenticator, Marcus is head of department. You're the Caravaggio expert. Your dissertation is the most comprehensive analysis of his technique published in the last decade. If anyone can determine authenticity definitively, it's you." It was manipulation, using funding leverage to force proximity, to create circumstances requiring ongoing professional contact. The same strategic thinking that had built his investment portfolio, now deployed to ensure she couldn't simply walk away from whatever conversation he wanted to have. "That's not Christie's usual authentication structure," she said evenly. "Then convince them to make an exception. The funding is contingent on your direct involvement. Marcus cleared his throat. "Mr. Morrison, perhaps we should discuss terms in my office. Ms. Laurent has prepared her preliminary assessment, which I believe addresses your immediate questions about the painting's potential authenticity." "Of course." Luca turned to face her directly. "Thank you for your expertise, Ms. Laurent. Your preliminary assessment is exactly what I needed to make an informed funding decision." "You're welcome." He held her gaze a moment longer. "I hope Christie's will approve the arrangement I'm proposing. I think this authentication deserves the best possible expertise." After he left with Marcus, Sophia stood alone with the painting, Judith's serene face, the general's terror, the violence frozen in oil and canvas 400 years ago. She'd spent 3 years building professional credibility at Christie's, built careful distance from personal entanglements, focused entirely on career advancement, proved herself through meticulous authentication work. Now, Luca Morrison was using his wealth to force proximity she hadn't chosen, creating professional circumstances that required extended contact, acting like he had the right to her time and expertise and attention. She wanted to refuse, wanted to tell. Marcus absolutely not. Wanted to let Elena handle the authentication if Morrison Capital insisted on funding it. Wanted to maintain the careful boundaries she'd spent 7 years constructing. But this was also the kind of comprehensive authentication project that could establish her reputation beyond Christie's institutional backing. Technical analysis of potentially major attribution, leading complex investigation, producing documentation that would be scrutinized by the entire art historical community. Career opportunity versus emotional protection. Professional advancement versus personal safety. She'd spent 7 years choosing career. Maybe she could handle 3 months of proximity without compromising either. That evening, Marcus called her into his office. The authentication committee would meet the next morning. Morrison Capital had submitted formal funding proposal for comprehensive technical analysis, contingent on Sophia's direct leadership of the project. They're offering £300,000 for comprehensive authentication, plus separate £100,000 research grant to Christie's for access to our facilities and expertise, Marcus explained. That's significantly more than we'd typically charge. The research grant essentially compensates us for lending you to an independent project. What does that mean for my position here? Temporary leave, 3 months, renewable for an additional 3 if authentication work requires it. You'd transition your current projects to Elena by end of next week. The authentication would be genuinely independent work, not representing Christie's institutional position. We've reviewed the provenance claims and agree with your assessment that this is likely high-quality follower work, not authentic Caravaggio. We're not investing our resources in what we expect will ultimately prove that conclusion. But they want me to prove it's authentic. Actually, Morrison's funding proposal specifically states they want accurate attribution regardless of outcome. That phrasing is unusual. Most private funders push for authentication that supports highest market valuation. Morrison Capital seems genuinely interested in truth rather than convenient attribution. Sophia considered this. You think it's legitimate? I think the contract protects your professional integrity. You maintain complete independence in methodology and conclusions. Your findings are yours to publish, regardless of what Morrison Capital might prefer. If anything, the contract terms suggest Morrison is either exceptionally ethical or playing some long game I can't detect. What would you do? Marcus leaned back in his chair. Professionally, this is the kind of comprehensive authentication project that establishes expertise beyond institutional affiliation. Win or lose on the attribution, you'll demonstrate technical competence and intellectual independence. That matters for your long-term career. And personally, I'd ask myself whether there's a reason Luca Morrison specifically wants you leading this authentication. Wealthy men don't usually involve themselves in authentication details. They hire experts and wait for results. Morrison is inserting himself into process. That suggests either genuine appreciation for your expertise or some other motivation I'd want to understand before committing months of work. Sophia had already asked herself that question, had spent the previous night examining it from every angle. Luca wanted proximity, wanted forced contact, wanted to create circumstances where she couldn't ignore him the way he'd once ignored her. But that didn't mean the professional opportunity wasn't genuine. "I'll have a lawyer review the contract," she said. "Good. Committee meets tomorrow at 9. I'll present the proposal with my recommendation that we approve your temporary leave." The lawyer's assessment arrived Friday morning. The contract was remarkably protective of her independence. She retained all rights to her findings, complete control over methodology, and explicit provision that Morrison Capital had no approval rights over her conclusions or publications. If anything, the terms were more favorable than typical private authentication funding. Either Luca Morrison genuinely wanted accurate authentication, regardless of outcome, or he was sophisticated enough to create contract terms that perfectly disguised other motivations. Sophia signed it that afternoon. By the following Monday, she'd transitioned her Christie's projects and moved her essential authentication equipment into the private lab space Morrison Capital had secured in South Kensington. The location was perfect, a converted gallery space on a quiet street, professionally equipped with museum-quality lighting, climate control, advanced security system, and enough room to work without institutional oversight or interruption. The painting arrived Wednesday morning in the same climate-controlled transit cases it had left Christie's in. Professional art movers handled the installation with practiced precision, positioning it on a museum-quality easel under optimal lighting conditions. After they left, Sophia stood alone with the painting for the first time since accepting the project. Judith and Holofernes, frozen in permanent violence, the heroine's serene face, the general's terror, the blood that seemed almost alive despite 400 years of age, real or copy, authentic Caravaggio or sophisticated follower work. She had 3 to 6 months to determine the truth. A note was pinned to the courier's manifest in Luca's handwriting. "Pursue the truth wherever it leads. That's all I ask." No signature. No personal addition. Just the instruction that defined the entire project. Sophia unpinned the note and set it on her work table. Then she pulled on nitrile gloves and began the comprehensive authentication process that Christie's had declined to fund. And possibly whether she could survive extended proximity to the man who disappeared from her life with nothing but a 2-word apology and 7 years of silence. Authentication was archaeology, systematic excavation through layers of assumption to reach underlying fact. She started with comprehensive photographic documentation under different lighting conditions, raking light to reveal texture and brushwork, ultraviolet to detect previous restoration or modern materials, infrared reflectography to examine underdrawing beneath the visible paint surface. The infrared results were immediately interesting. Beneath the finished painting, she could see preliminary sketches, confident lines establishing composition, blocking out the major figures, indicating the dramatic lighting scheme. But the style of underdrawing showed slight differences from the final execution. The preliminary sketch was quick, gestural, establishing composition efficiently. The final painting was more controlled, more deliberate, as if someone had carefully rendered a composition they had already determined rather than discovering it through the painting process. Caravaggio typically worked without extensive underdrawing. He painted directly, improvisationally, adjusting composition as he discovered the drama through application of paint. This showed planning, preparation, the methodical approach of someone copying a known composition rather than inventing it. She documented everything with obsessive precision, photographed the underdrawing from multiple angles, took microscopic samples from several locations for pigment analysis, arranged for X-ray fluorescence testing at a university laboratory to analyze the elemental composition of the paint layers, cross-referenced brushwork patterns with authenticated Manfredi works in the reference library she'd compiled. 2 weeks into the authentication process, she was confident in her preliminary assessment. This was exceptional period work, technically sophisticated and emotionally powerful, but not Caravaggio himself. The brushwork lacked his characteristic aggressive energy. The composition showed too much planning. The paint application was controlled rather than improvised. Most likely Bartolomeo Manfredi, working in Rome circa 1615 to 1620, creating a contemporary copy of Caravaggio's Judith and Holofernes composition, still valuable, still art historically significant, but worth 5 to 8 million rather than 45. Her phone rang that Thursday evening, Luca's name on the screen. "How's the work progressing?" he asked. "On schedule. Preliminary technical findings support my initial visual assessment. Follower work? Most likely Manfredi, but I'm not making definitive statements until I have complete laboratory analysis. I need at least another month of systematic testing before I can write confident conclusions. Of course, I wasn't calling for updates. The contract specifies weekly, written reports, not verbal check-ins. Then why did you call? To see if you'd have dinner with me. Sophia looked at the painting, Judith's serene face, the violence she was committing with such calm purpose, strategic decision-making under pressure. That's not what we agreed to, she said. We agreed I wouldn't interfere with your professional work. We didn't agree I couldn't ask you to dinner as two people who used to know each other and might benefit from actual conversation. Luca, I'm not asking for reconciliation or resuming anything. I'm asking for a meal and maybe some honest conversation about Paris, questions I should have asked 7 years ago instead of just disappearing. What questions? Why you stayed in Paris that summer? What made you trust me? What your favorite memory was from those months before I destroyed everything by choosing cowardice over courage. Sophia's chest tightened. This was dangerous territory. Professional boundaries existed for good reason. Maintaining emotional distance was essential for surviving the next 3 months without falling apart. But she'd spent 7 years wondering about his reasons. 7 years constructing explanations and dismantling them, trying to understand why he'd left without explanation. Thursday next week, she said, somewhere quiet. And Luca, this is just dinner, not reconciliation, not forgiveness, not resuming anything. Just two people having a conversation, 7 years overdue. I'll take it. He chose a small Italian restaurant in Mayfair. Expensive enough for privacy, intimate enough for honest conversation. Sophia arrived deliberately 15 minutes late, asserting control through timing, refusing to appear eager or available. Luca was already there, standing when she approached, pulling out her chair with gestures that felt respectful rather than automatic. He looked different outside the business context, still polished, still wearing wealth-like tailoring, but somehow more real. Charcoal cashmere sweater, dark jeans, less armor than his usual Tom Ford suits. You look beautiful, he said. Sorry, professional boundaries. You look professionally accomplished in a manner that happens to also be aesthetically striking. Despite herself, she almost smiled. Better? They ordered. Sophia chose the wine because he asked her preference rather than assuming. Small detail, but it registered. 7 years ago, he'd made assumptions about what she'd want, where she'd go, how she'd react. Now he was asking. Tell me about Paris, he said after the sommelier left. What were you doing there that summer? Dissertation research, Caravaggio's use of violence as theatrical device. The Louvre has extensive collections of Italian Baroque work, and the Bibliothèque Nationale had documentation I needed for my argument about his relationship with stage brutality versus observed reality. And evenings? Some evenings I spent with you. Best. Summer of my life. Sophia met his eyes across the table. Candlelight caught the gray at his temples, the lines that 7 years had carved into his face. He looked older, harder, like someone who'd paid for his choices and knew exactly what they'd cost. Then why did you leave? She asked. Luca was quiet for a long moment. She watched him calculate, saw the strategic thinking that had built a £12 billion portfolio, then saw him deliberately set strategy aside in favor of something that looked like actual honesty. My father arrived in Paris unexpectedly that summer. You remember meeting him? I remember him looking at me like I was a problem to be solved. That's exactly how he saw you, not because of anything you were or did, but because of what you represented to his carefully constructed plans for my future. Deviation from trajectory, distraction from the path he'd designed for my life since I was born. Luca's voice was controlled, precise, delivering information he'd clearly rehearsed. The night after that dinner, he told me I had 2 choices. End things with you immediately and return to London to begin formal transition into Morrison Capital leadership. Or continue the relationship and be cut off completely. No inheritance, no position in the company, no access to family resources or connections. Full disinheritance. The wine arrived. Sophia drank before responding, needing the moment to process what he'd just said. So, you chose the money, she said finally. I chose cowardice disguised as pragmatism. I told myself I was being strategic, that I couldn't give up everything my family had built over multiple generations, that you deserve better than a man with no prospects or resources. But really, I was just afraid. Afraid of disappointing my father, afraid of losing the security of predetermined success, afraid of discovering that love without financial foundation was harder than I was willing to handle. Did you ever consider asking me, telling me what he'd said and letting me be part of the decision? Every single day for 7 years. That's not an answer to my question. No, I didn't consider it at the time, because I was 28 years old and trained since childhood to manage problems through control and unilateral decision-making, rather than through partnership and honest communication. Because I knew if I told you, you'd tell me to choose what I actually wanted, and I was terrified I'd choose wrong. He paused. I chose wrong anyway. Just chose the cowardly version that hurt you more and gave me less. Sophia processed this carefully. 7 years of wondering, and the answer was simultaneously simple and devastating. He'd been afraid, had chosen safety over risk, had left her to protect himself from the consequences of choosing her. What would you have done, she asked, if your father hadn't given you that ultimatum? Stayed in Paris longer, extended my time there, eventually asked you to come to London with me. Probably proposed within a year, because I was completely in love with you and too young to understand that love without communication foundation is just emotional intensity without sustainable structure. We would have had problems. Absolutely. I was arrogant, controlling, trained to make unilateral decisions. You were independent, professionally ambitious, didn't tolerate manipulation or assumption. We would have fought about career priorities, about whose ambition took precedence, about how to balance my family expectations with your professional goals, about the fundamental power dynamics of me having wealth and you not. But we would have had the chance to figure it out. Yes, we would have had that chance. And I took it away from both of us because I was too afraid to choose you over my father's approval and the security of inherited success. Their food arrived. They ate in silence for a moment, processing honesty that had waited 7 years to be spoken. He died 3 years ago, Sophia said finally. Your father. I saw it in the business press when I searched your name before the Christie's viewing. Cancer, pancreatic, 6 months from diagnosis to death. Brutal and fast, and he spent all 6 months trying to control everything he couldn't anymore. I'm sorry. I'm not. Luca's voice was flat, emotionless in a way that suggested significant emotion buried underneath. He spent 48 years manipulating everyone around him, treating people as strategic assets rather than human beings, building empire without considering the human cost or the relationships he destroyed in pursuit of profit and control. I spent his last 6 months watching him panic about legacy, about whether Morrison Capital would survive without his direct management, about whether I'd proven worthy of the inheritance I'd sacrificed you to protect. That must have been difficult. It was clarifying. He'd made me choose between love and inheritance, then died before I could properly claim what I'd sacrificed everything for. And the inheritance came with conditions anyway. Turned out giving up, you wasn't enough. I still had to prove myself worthy, according to his posthumous requirements. Sophia set down her fork. What requirements? Luca met her eyes. My father's will included a codicil, specific condition I had to fulfill before gaining full control of Morrison Capital and his personal estate. The management committee that took over after his death held control until I satisfied the requirement. What was the requirement? That I demonstrate in writing and to the satisfaction of the estate lawyers that I had made at least one major business decision based on ethical considerations and cultural value rather than pure financial return. Something that showed I understood Morrison Capital's responsibility extended beyond profit maximization to genuine social contribution and preservation of cultural heritage. Sophia felt pieces clicking into place with uncomfortable precision. The authentication. The authentication. My father somehow knew about this painting before he died, had information suggesting it would surface at Christie's, left specific instructions that, if it did, and if I chose to fund proper authentication, regardless of financial outcome or attribution result, it would satisfy the codicil requirement and prove I'd learned to value truth and cultural contribution over profit. How did he know about the painting? I have no idea. The family that owns it has no connection to Morrison Capital that I can find. No business relationship, no social overlap, no obvious information channel. Somehow, he knew it existed and anticipated it would surface at Christie's after his death. Luca's expression was complicated, anger and respect and resentment mixed together. He manipulated us one final time from beyond the grave, set up circumstances where funding your work would serve my inheritance interests, where supporting you became strategically advantageous to my financial future. Does that change why you're doing it? No, I'm funding the authentication because it's the right thing to do, because your work deserves professional support, because this painting deserves proper examination regardless of market value or attribution outcome, because Thomas Blackwell. He stopped. Who's Thomas Blackwell? Luca looked uncomfortable. Independent authenticator based in Oxford. I found him during my research into the painting's history. He's been affiliated with the British Museum as a visiting scholar for years, examining their Renaissance collections. He examined this work 2 years ago for the family. Preliminary assessment suggesting authentic Caravaggio. Died in a car accident 3 weeks after submitting his initial report. Sophia's hands went cold. The family consulted an authenticator before Christie's? According to the documentation I found, yes. Blackwell did initial examination, found it promising enough to recommend comprehensive analysis, was preparing detailed technical study, then died in what was ruled a traffic accident. Family stopped pursuing authentication until this year when they approached Christie's. Why didn't Marcus mention this? Maybe he didn't know. Maybe Christie's due diligence didn't extend to researching previous authentication attempts. But someone knew Blackwell had examined the painting. Someone knows you're now doing the work he started. You think his death wasn't accidental? I think it's suspicious that an authenticator dies weeks after examining a potentially £45 million painting. I think it's worth investigating. And I think you need to be very careful until we understand what actually happened to Thomas Blackwell and whether you're in similar danger. Sophia looked at her wine glass, at the expensive restaurant, at the man who disappeared from her life 7 years ago and was now telling her she might be in danger from the same forces that had possibly killed another authenticator. This is insane, she said. I know. I'm authenticating a painting, not investigating a murder. Maybe you're doing both. I should walk away, tell you to find another authenticator, return the painting to the family, and let them pursue authentication elsewhere. You could do that, or you could finish what Thomas Blackwell started. Find out if this painting is authentic Caravaggio or sophisticated follower work. Determine the truth regardless of who doesn't want you to discover it. And risk whatever happened to Blackwell happening to me? Not if I can prevent it. I've already hired enhanced security for the lab. 2 former military professionals who will maintain discreet but continuous presence. I'm hiring a private investigator to look into Blackwell's death and any connections to the painting's ownership. And I'm going to be much more involved in the authentication process than the contract technically requires. Luca, I'm not letting you do this alone, not when there's even a possibility that someone killed Thomas Blackwell to stop his authentication and might target you for the same reason. Sophia studied his face across the table. The determination that had built a £12 billion portfolio now deployed to protect her from potential danger he'd uncovered. It should have felt controlling. Instead, it felt like someone actually giving a damn about her safety. Okay, she said finally, enhanced security, private investigation into Blackwell's death, and you stay involved enough to monitor any threats. But Luca, the authentication findings remain mine. You don't get to influence my conclusions or suppress my results regardless of what they mean for your inheritance or the painting's value. I wouldn't want to. The whole point is accurate authentication. Truth over convenience. That's what satisfies my father's codicil and what matters for the art historical record. Then we continue. Together. But carefully. Very carefully. Outside the restaurant, London evening wrapped around them. October air turning cold, city lights reflecting off wet pavement, the comfortable anonymity of Mayfair streets after dinner. Thank you for telling me the truth, Sophia said. About Paris, about your father, about Blackwell, about all of it. Thank you for listening. I know it doesn't undo 7 years of silence or change what I did, but maybe understanding why helps. It helps. Doesn't fix it, but helps. Is understanding enough for you to consider forgiving me eventually? Sophia looked at him. 7 years older, carrying visible weight of regret and consequences. Still dangerous to her carefully protected heart. Still capable of breaking her if she let him close enough. Ask me again when the authentication is finished, she said. When we've proven we can work together without you disappearing, when things get complicated or dangerous. Fair enough? He raised his hand for a cab. Can I call you? Not about work, just to talk. Yes, but Luca, if you're using the authentication as excuse to manipulate proximity or engineer emotional reconciliation, I will know and I will end this project immediately. Noted, pure professional protection with occasional personal conversation. No manipulation. Good. The cab arrived. She climbed in, gave the driver her Brixton address, didn't look back as they pulled away from the restaurant and the man who'd spent 7 years haunting her careful emotional distance. She'd agreed to continue the authentication, had accepted enhanced security, had allowed Luca back into her professional life with the explicit understanding that this was about the painting and Thomas Blackwell's possibly murdered investigation, not about resuming their relationship. But alone in the cab, watching London pass through rain-streaked windows, Sophia acknowledged what she hadn't said at dinner, that seeing him again hurt, that understanding his reasons didn't erase 7 years of silence, that forgiving him felt dangerous and probably foolish and maybe inevitable if he could actually prove he'd changed, that she was already in too deep to protect herself properly. The security arrived the next morning, 2 men, early 40s, former military bearing obvious in their posture and alertness. They introduced themselves as James and Daniel, positioned themselves unobtrusively near the lab entrance, and made it clear they took their assignment seriously. Luca's private investigator delivered her initial findings that afternoon. Catherine Wright, former Scotland Yard detective turned private investigation specialist, had the kind of sharp competence that suggested she'd seen everything and been surprised by nothing. Thomas Blackwell's death was investigated by local police, she said, spreading files across Sophia's work table. Traffic accident, single vehicle collision. Witnesses reported he ran a red light at high speed. Toxicology was clean. Investigation concluded accidental death, possibly due to distraction or medical event. You don't sound convinced. I'm not. Blackwell was 63 years old, healthy, no history of risky driving or traffic violations. Had been a visiting scholar authenticator at the British Museum for 40 years with stellar reputation for thoroughness and accuracy. 3 weeks before his death, he completed preliminary examination of your painting and submitted initial report to the family suggesting authentic Caravaggio. But Catherine pulled out another document. His personal notes, retrieved from his estate by his daughter, who's cooperating with my investigation. The official report said authentic Caravaggio. His private notes, written 2 days before his death, say this. She pushed the document towards Sophia. Thomas Blackwell's handwriting, precise and controlled, dated 2 days before his death. I was wrong in my initial assessment. The underdrawing doesn't match Caravaggio's working method. The pigment layering suggests different application technique. The brushwork, examined under magnification, lacks his characteristic gestural energy. This is exceptional follower work, most likely Bartolomeo Manfredi, not Caravaggio himself. I need to inform the family before they invest in comprehensive authentication, based on my erroneous initial findings. They won't be pleased, but accuracy matters more than their commercial hopes. Meeting with them Friday to deliver revised assessment. He died Thursday night. Never made it to Friday's meeting. Sophia read the note 3 times, feeling pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. He discovered it was follower work, was going to tell the family their Caravaggio was actually worth a fraction of what they had hoped, died the night before that meeting. £45 million versus £5 million is strong motivation, Catherine said. The family's name is Romano, old money, Italian aristocracy, extensive property holdings, but property rich and cash poor, like many aristocratic families. They need liquidity. A £45 million Caravaggio solves their financial problems. A £5 million Manfredi helps but doesn't solve. You think they killed him? I think someone with financial interest in maintaining the Caravaggio attribution had strong motivation to prevent his revised assessment from becoming public. I think the timing is suspicious. And I think you're now doing the work that got Thomas Blackwell killed, which puts you at similar risk. The lab suddenly felt smaller, more dangerous. The painting on its easel watching with Judith's serene face, violence frozen in permanent execution. What do I do? Sophia asked. Continue the authentication with enhanced security. Document everything obsessively. Make sure multiple copies of your findings exist in secure locations. And be very, very careful about who knows your conclusions before you're ready to go public. The police should investigate. They will. I'm taking my findings to the Art and Antiques unit this afternoon. But investigation takes time, and you're vulnerable now. Hence the security and the careful documentation. After Catherine left, Sophia stood alone with the painting and Thomas Blackwell's notes and the uncomfortable knowledge that authentication had become considerably more dangerous than determining artistic attribution. Luca arrived that evening after the security shift change. He brought Thai food from her favorite restaurant in Soho, information she hadn't given him, but that he apparently remembered from 7 years ago. Catherine briefed me, he said, unpacking containers on her work table. Blackwell's notes are damning. Someone had serious motivation to stop him from delivering that revised assessment. The Romano family, possibly, or someone connected to them, who knew about the painting's potential value, someone who stands to benefit from it being authenticated as Caravaggio rather than Manfredi. Sophia picked at the pad thai, appetite gone, despite not having eaten since breakfast. I should stop. Walk away. This isn't worth dying for. Stopping now suggests the threat worked, proves that intimidation and violence can silence authenticators. Continuing suggests I'm willing to risk my life for art historical accuracy. Are you? She looked at the painting, at Thomas Blackwell's precise handwriting documenting his realization, at the truth he'd died trying to reveal. Accuracy matters, she said quietly. Thomas Blackwell knew that, built a 40-year career on that principle, died trying to honor it. The least I can do is finish his work. Luca studied her across the work table. You're either very brave or very stubborn. Both, probably. Then we do this properly. Complete documentation, multiple backup copies stored in different secure locations, police involvement and protection. And I'm going to be here more often than the contract requires. Consider me an unpaid assistant with security training. That's going to complicate the professional boundaries. I know. But I'm not letting you do this alone, not when Thomas Blackwell died, and someone might target you for finishing his authentication. Sophia should have argued, should have maintained boundaries and professional distance, should have protected herself from the emotional complication of Luca Morrison becoming more involved in her work and her daily life. But she was afraid, not of the authentication itself, but of whoever had possibly killed Thomas Blackwell to prevent accurate attribution. And having Luca present, with his resources and his protection and his stubborn refusal to let her face danger alone, felt less like manipulation and more like actual partnership. Okay, she said, you can be here, help with the authentication process, provide security presence. But Luca, if you disappear when this gets difficult or dangerous, if you choose safety over courage the way you did 7 years ago, I will never forgive you. Not eventually, not with time, not ever. I know, and I'm not going anywhere. Not until this is finished, not until you're safe, not until we know the truth about the painting and about Thomas Blackwell's death. Behind them, Judith held Holofernes' head, serene and terrible, biblical judgment rendered after careful examination. Some violence was necessary, some truths required blood. Sophia just hoped finishing Blackwell's authentication wouldn't require hers. The police investigation moved with bureaucratic precision, while Sophia's authentication work proceeded with scientific methodology. 2 weeks after Catherine Wright had delivered Thomas Blackwell's notes, Detective Inspector Sarah Chen from the Art and Antiques unit called a meeting at the lab. She arrived with files, photographs, and the exhausted determination of someone who'd spent years chasing art fraud through layers of shell corporations and international banking. We've identified a connection, she said, spreading documents across Sophia's work table. Thomas Blackwell's phone records show 3 calls to a London number in the week before his death. The number belongs to Richard Crane, senior analyst at Morrison Capital. Luca, who'd been reviewing authentication documentation, went very still. "Richard has been with Morrison Capital for 8 years," he said quietly. "My father hired him personally. He handles private equity analysis and due diligence on art investments and luxury assets." "Did your father know the family that owns the painting?" D.I. Chen asked. "Not that I'm aware of, but Richard would have access to my father's personal files, his private correspondence, anything he was working on before he died, including whatever information my father had about this painting when he wrote the codicil." Sophia felt pieces assembling with uncomfortable precision. "Your father knew about this painting before he died, knew it would come to market, knew it would surface at Christie's. What if Richard was involved in that knowledge? What if your father tasked him with tracking it, researching it, establishing connections to the family?" "And Richard saw an opportunity," Luca finished, his voice hard. £45 million if the painting authenticates as Caravaggio. Significant commission potential. Strong motivation to ensure the authentication goes the right way. "Or to stop authenticators who reach the wrong conclusion," D.I. Chen added. The implications hung in the air like chemical residue. Richard Crane, senior Morrison Capital analyst, with access to the late Edward Morrison's files and instructions, with professional connections to art dealers and auction houses, with motivation to protect a potentially fraudulent £45 million valuation. "We need to question him," Luca said. "Already arranged, this afternoon. I'd like you both present for the interview. Sophia, you can identify any technical misrepresentations about authentication. Luca, you can recognize any discrepancies in his explanation of Morrison Capital's involvement." They went to Scotland Yard that afternoon. The interview room was exactly what Sophia had expected from television. Observation window, recording equipment, institutional furniture designed for discomfort and honesty through exhaustion. Richard Crane arrived with his lawyer. He was 42, expensively dressed in Richard James tailoring, carrying the polished competence of someone who'd spent years managing other people's money and expectations. His Rolex Daytona was platinum. His Hermes briefcase was vintage. His whole presentation screamed wealth management professional who understood luxury as both asset class and lifestyle. He maintained perfect composure through the initial questions. Yes, he knew Thomas Blackwell. Yes, they'd spoken about the painting. No, nothing unusual about those conversations. "Mr. Blackwell contacted me," Richard explained, voice smooth and practiced. He'd heard Morrison Capital had interest in Italian Baroque art investments. Wanted to know if we'd consider funding comprehensive authentication of a painting he'd examined. I told him we'd need preliminary findings before committing to that expense. He sent initial documentation suggesting the painting was authentic Caravaggio. I told him Morrison Capital would be very interested in funding further analysis if the preliminary assessment proved accurate. "And then Mr. Blackwell died," D.I. Chen said. "Tragic accident. I was sorry to hear about it." "Were you aware Mr. Blackwell had changed his preliminary assessment, that he'd concluded the painting was follower work, not Caravaggio, and was planning to inform relevant parties?" Richard's expression didn't change. No surprise, no discomfort. Nothing but professional neutrality. "No, he never communicated that to me. Our last conversation, 3 days before his death, he seemed confident the painting was authentic. If he'd changed his mind, he didn't mention it." 3 calls in the week before his death. D.I. Chen slid phone records across the table. "What did you discuss?" "Authentication methodology, timeline for comprehensive analysis, funding arrangements if Morrison Capital decided to proceed with the project." "Nothing about revised findings?" "Nothing. He seemed confident. If he'd developed concerns, he didn't share them with me." Sophia watched Richard maintain perfect composure. No nervous gestures, no defensive body language, no micro-expressions of deception. Either he was telling the truth, or he was exceptionally skilled at lying. "Let me ask a different question," D.I. Chen said. "Did you have any financial interest in the painting's authentication outcome beyond Morrison Capital's general investment strategy?" "Only our firm's interest in sound art investments that align with our portfolio diversification goals." "No personal stake? No private arrangement with the family that owns the painting?" No commission agreement contingent on successful authentication? None whatsoever. Then you won't mind providing your financial records, bank statements, investment accounts, any transactions involving art or private sales in the past 3 years. For the first time, Richard hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, barely detectable. But Sophia caught it. So did D.I. Chen. I'll need to consult my lawyer before providing that information, Richard said carefully. Of course, we'll arrange for you to do so. D.I. Chen stood. One more question. Do you know who sent threatening emails to Sophia Laurent telling her to stop the current authentication? I have no knowledge of any threats. But you do know about Ms. Laurent's authentication work. How did you learn about it? Morrison Capital is funding the project. It's not confidential information within the firm. Did you advise Mr. Morrison against funding the authentication? Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack in his professional composure. I advised him that independent authentication of a painting Christie's had already declined was questionable business practice, that we should focus our art investment resources on works with clearer provenance and institutional backing. He chose to proceed anyway. Why do you think he made that choice? You'd have to ask him. After Richard left with his lawyer, D.I. Chen joined Sophia and Luca in the observation room. He's lying about something, Sophia said. The hesitation about financial records. The too perfect composure until you questioned his advice to Luca. He's involved in this somehow. But I can't prove he killed Blackwell or sent you threats, D.I. Chen said. Not yet. We need concrete evidence connecting him to the painting's outcome. Financial transactions, communications with the family, something that establishes motive and means. I can get that evidence, Luca said quietly. Mr. Morrison, this is a police investigation. I need you to let us handle. Richard has access to Morrison Capital's systems, our private investment records, internal communications, analysis files. If he's involved in art fraud or authentication manipulation, there will be evidence in his work files, communications he conducted using our infrastructure, analysis he prepared for my father. I have legal access to all of it as CEO. That could compromise the investigation if obtained improperly. It could also save time, and while you're building your case properly and legally through warrant processes, Richard has opportunity to destroy evidence. He knows he's under investigation now. He'll start covering his tracks. Let me look through Morrison Capital files before he can sanitize them. If I find something relevant, I'll bring it to you immediately for proper legal seizure. D.I. Chen considered running calculations about proper procedure versus practical necessity. If you find evidence through improper means, it's inadmissible in court. But it might tell you where to look for admissible evidence, what to request in warrants, which financial institutions to subpoena. She nodded reluctantly. Do what you need to do, but document everything carefully. If this goes to trial, we need clean chains of evidence that won't get thrown out on technicalities. Luca spent that evening in Morrison Capital's secure archives, pulling Richard's files with the authority of CEO reviewing employee work. Sophia stayed in the lab, continuing authentication work, while James and Daniel stood security outside, increasingly alert now that the investigation had identified a specific threat. She was examining pigment samples under magnification when Luca returned at 11 p.m. His expression was grim, angry, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Grief, maybe, or disappointment in discoveries he'd hoped not to make. I found something, he said. Not proof of murder, but proof of fraud. Extensive fraud. He spread documents across the lab table. Investment analysis, private sale recommendations, communications between Richard and various art dealers across Europe, email chains discussing authentication strategies and market positioning. Richard has been running a side business for at least 5 years, Luca explained, his voice carefully controlled, connecting wealthy clients with undervalued or questionably attributed art, taking commission on private sales. Not illegal by itself, but he's been using Morrison Capital's resources, reputation, and research infrastructure to broker deals without disclosure to the firm or our clients. Conflict of interest, violation of his employment contract, grounds for immediate termination, and potentially fraud charges, depending on how he structured the transactions. Did he have connection to the family that owns the painting? Sophia asked. Yes, direct connection. The family name is Romano, Italian aristocracy, extensive property holdings, but apparently cash poor. Alessandro Romano, the patriarch, is listed in Richard's private client files. Richard brokered 2 previous art sales for the Romano family over the past 3 years. 17th century Italian landscapes, both authenticated through processes that look questionable in retrospect. Both sold to private collectors for significantly inflated prices based on optimistic attributions. So, Richard had prior relationship with the Romano family, financial incentive to help them get favorable authentication on the Caravaggio. And when Thomas Blackwell was going to expose the painting as follower work worth a fraction of the claimed value, Richard had very strong motivation to stop him. Luca's expression was hard, controlled fury barely contained. My father must have known about Richard's side business. That's why he included the codicil requiring me to make an ethical business decision. He wanted me to demonstrate commitment to cultural integrity specifically, because he knew Richard was operating unethically and wanted me to prove I was different. Your father knew Richard was corrupt? My father was probably complicit in some capacity. Richard's side business generated valuable connections to wealthy European families and private collectors. My father would have seen that as useful business development, not ethical violation. The codicil was his way of testing whether I'd choose integrity over expedience when facing similar situations. Sophia processed this uncomfortable truth. The late Edward Morrison, manipulating his son from beyond the grave, testing whether Luca would make the ethical choice his father never had. We need to give this to D.I. Chen, she said. Already scheduled meeting tomorrow morning at 8. But, Sophia, there's something else. Something worse. Luca pulled up another document. Richard took a private loan 6 months ago. £2 million. The lender is listed as a shell corporation, but tracing the ownership through Cyprus and Luxembourg accounts leads back to the Romano family. They paid him £2 million 6 months ago, right around when they were preparing to approach Christie's with the painting. They paid him to ensure favorable authentication, or paid him to stop unfavorable authentication. If Richard pressured Thomas Blackwell, suggested the preliminary findings should stay preliminary, threatened him professionally or financially if he exposed the painting as follower work, then Blackwell's death might not have been accident. It might have been murder motivated by £2 million and the threat of exposure. They stared at the documents spread across the work table. Evidence of corruption, conflict of interest, undisclosed payments, and potential motive for murder. Not proof of homicide, but strong foundation for investigation and prosecution. I need to fire him tomorrow, Luca said, before he realizes we know, before he has opportunity to destroy more evidence or flee. D.I. Chen will want to handle that carefully. If Richard knows he's under investigation for murder, he might panic. Destroy evidence, leave the country, do something desperate. Then we coordinate with police, give them everything, let them build the case properly, and hope they move fast enough to prevent Richard from covering his tracks or putting you in more danger. The next morning, D.I. Chen arrived with a warrant and 3 other officers. Richard Crane was arrested at Morrison Capital on suspicion of fraud, conflict of interest, and obstruction of justice. His home and office were searched simultaneously. Computer files were seized. Financial records were subpoenaed from 3 banks. The evidence, once D.I. Chen's team started assembling it, was extensive. Richard had been running his private art brokerage for 5 years, hidden within his legitimate Morrison Capital work. Had connections to dozens of dealers, authenticators, and wealthy families across Europe. The Romano family was his largest client by far. He'd brokered 7 sales for them over 3 years, taking 20% commission on transactions totaling approximately £15 million in aggregate. The Caravaggio was meant to be his biggest success. £45 million if it authenticated as genuine Caravaggio. £9 million commission for Richard, split with the Romano family according to their private agreement. But Thomas Blackwell had threatened that outcome with his revised assessment, and Richard Crane had made sure Thomas Blackwell never delivered that revised assessment to anyone who mattered. D.I. Chen showed Sophia and Luca the recovered communications 2 days after the arrest. Emails between Richard and Alessandro Romano discussing the Blackwell problem and necessary interventions. Text messages using careful language about unfortunate accidents that sometimes happened to people who created unnecessary complications. deleted files partially recovered from Richard's computer, showing wire transfers from Romano family accounts to Richard's personal offshore holdings the week after Blackwell's death. We're charging him with fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice immediately, D.I. Chen said. The murder investigation is still building. Blackwell's death was ruled accidental at the time, so proving Richard arranged it requires significant additional evidence. But we're examining his phone location data from that day, financial records showing payments to potential accomplices, known associates who might have helped arrange the accident. We're also investigating the accident itself more thoroughly, interviewing witnesses again, looking at traffic camera footage, examining the vehicle for signs of mechanical tampering. What about the Romano family? Sophia asked. Alessandro Romano is being questioned in Italy. His son Marco claims no knowledge of Richard's activities, says his father handled all art transactions independently without involving other family members. We're investigating whether the family was complicit in the authentication fraud and potentially in Blackwell's death, or whether Alessandro was operating without their knowledge or consent. And the painting needs to be authenticated. Whatever the result, it doesn't change the fraud charges against Richard or the evidence of his corrupt business practices. But the truth matters for determining the Romano family's knowledge and complicity. If they genuinely believed it was Caravaggio based on optimistic self-deception, they're victims of their own desperation. If they knew it was follower work and conspired with Richard to manipulate authentication, they're accomplices to fraud and potentially to murder. Sophia returned to the lab that afternoon. 3 months of authentication work, interrupted by threats and investigation and murder inquiry. Now she needed to finish what Thomas Blackwell had started, needed to determine the truth that someone had possibly killed to hide. The final comprehensive analysis took 2 more weeks. Complete pigment testing using gas chromatography mass spectrometry. Exhaustive examination of underdrawing using multiple imaging techniques. Consultation with 5 leading Baroque specialists at universities and museums across Europe. Carbon dating of canvas materials. Analysis of the wooden stretcher for age verification. Every possible technical examination to ensure absolute accuracy. She documented everything with obsessive precision, knowing the authentication would face intense scrutiny in court if Richard's case went to trial. Photographed every stage of testing, recorded every measurement, saved every spectroscopic reading, built a comprehensive technical record that could withstand legal challenge and academic peer review. The conclusion, after 2 weeks of systematic examination, was definitive. The painting was exceptional early 17th century work, technically sophisticated, executed with expensive period-appropriate materials, emotionally powerful in its rendering of biblical violence. Almost certainly Bartolomeo Manfredi, contemporary follower of Caravaggio working in Rome circa 1615 to 1620, a contemporary copy of Caravaggio's composition, painted with considerable skill, but lacking the improvisational energy and aggressive brushwork characteristic of Caravaggio himself, historically significant, valuable in its own right. A fine example of Caravaggisti painting that deserved proper attribution and preservation, worth approximately £4 million with accurate attribution to Manfredi, not Caravaggio. Thomas Blackwell's revised assessment had been absolutely correct. Sophia prepared her formal authentication report with meticulous documentation, 200 pages of scientific findings, comparative analysis, expert consultations, technical data, and comprehensive photographic evidence. Everything necessary to establish beyond reasonable doubt that the painting was follower work, not master. She delivered copies to D.I. Chen for the criminal investigation, to Morrison Capital's lawyers for the corporate fraud case, and to the Romano family through proper legal channels. Marco Romano requested a meeting 3 days later. Sophia agreed, with D.I. Chen present and Luca attending as Morrison Capital's representative since the firm had funded the authentication. They met at the lab, neutral territory, with security present and everything recorded for legal protection. Marco Romano was 38, Italian aristocracy evident in his bearing and expensive but understated clothing. Grief was visible in his expression, exhaustion in his posture. He looked like someone who'd spent weeks dealing with police investigations and family crisis and the collapse of desperate hopes. My father is dying, he said without preamble, voice flat with exhaustion. Cancer, pancreatic, stage 4, 6 months to live, maybe less. He's confessed everything to me. Told me about Richard Crane, about the arrangement they made, about Thomas Blackwell. I came to tell you what he told me, to explain, not excuse, but at least make you understand. Go ahead, D.I. Chen said. Marco took a careful breath. Richard approached my father 3 years ago, claimed he could help us with our financial situation through strategic art sales, said our paintings were worth more than we realized, just needed proper authentication and market positioning. My father was desperate. The estate is bankrupt. We've been selling everything for years, trying to cover debts and taxes and maintenance on properties we can't afford to keep. He thought Richard was offering legitimate business expertise. When did he learn about the Caravaggio? Sophia asked. Richard told him 2 years ago that he believed one of our paintings might be authentic Caravaggio, had it examined by Thomas Blackwell, who provided initial assessment suggesting it was genuine. My father was thrilled, thought it would save the family. 45 million pounds would solve all our financial problems. Let us keep the estate, preserve our legacy. Did he know Richard arranged Thomas Blackwell's death? D.I. Chen asked directly. Marco's face crumpled. He knew Richard said Blackwell had become unreliable, knew there was an accident. I don't think he understood at the time that it was murder. I hope he didn't. But he paid Richard 2 million pounds after Blackwell died to ensure the next authentication would go differently, to guarantee favorable results. His voice broke. He was a proud man. Couldn't accept that our great family legacy included a copy, not a masterpiece. Couldn't face selling it for 4 million instead of 45 million. Made terrible choices because he couldn't accept reduced circumstances. I'm sorry, Sophia said quietly, about your father, about the painting, about all of it. Don't be sorry about the painting. Be honest about it. That's all Thomas Blackwell wanted. That's all my family deserves now. Marco looked at her authentication report, 200 pages of technical truth. Will you help us sell it properly, with accurate attribution and honest representation? I know it's not worth what we hoped, but maybe it's worth enough to let my father die knowing we finally told the truth. I'll help, Sophia said. Morrison Capital is establishing an authentication institute. Independent, ethical, committed to accuracy over market manipulation. We can handle the sale properly. Correct attribution, honest documentation, transparent process. Authentication Institute? Marco asked. Luca spoke for the first time since the meeting began. We're founding it in Thomas Blackwell's name. Independent authentication services, ethical examination, truth over profit. Sophia will direct it. Your painting will be our first official project. Properly attributed to Manfredi, honestly presented, with full documentation of what it actually is and what it represents historically. Marco nodded slowly. Thomas Blackwell would approve of that. He died trying to tell the truth about our painting. The least we can do is honor his commitment to accuracy. He left after signing agreements for the ethical sale process. D.I. Chen followed, promising to keep them updated on the criminal case against Richard Crane. Sophia and Luca stood alone in the lab with the painting and 200 pages of authentication documentation, and the uncomfortable knowledge that Richard Crane's trial would take months, and that Alessandro Romano would likely die before seeing justice for what he'd set in motion. We should have found this sooner, Sophia said quietly. Should have prevented it somehow. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. Authenticated the painting accurately, honored Thomas Blackwell's work, told the truth despite threats. Someone died because of this painting, because of greed and desperation and the 41 million pound difference between Caravaggio and Manfredi. Someone died because Richard Crane chose murder over honesty. That's not on you. That's not on the painting. That's on the people who valued money more than human life. Sophia looked at the painting, Judith's serene face, the violence she was committing, the judgment she was rendering. Some truths required blood. Some authentication required courage. She'd finished Thomas Blackwell's work, had exposed the fraud, had proven the painting was exceptional follower work worth preserving and studying, but not the masterpiece desperate people had needed it to be. The truth was worth 4 million pounds and one man's integrity. She just wished it hadn't cost Thomas Blackwell his life. Richard Crane was convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and manslaughter 8 months after his arrest. The trial had been meticulous, detailed, devastating. The prosecution proved he'd arranged Thomas Blackwell's accident through an associate who'd tampered with the brake lines, proved the £2 million payment from Alessandro Romano, proved the extensive art fraud operation that had defrauded collectors across Europe for 5 years. He was sentenced to 22 years. Alessandro Romano died 4 months after the trial concluded. Cancer, as Marco had predicted. He never faced charges due to terminal illness, but he'd written a full confession detailing his involvement with Richard's schemes, his desperation to save the family estate, his choice to believe Richard's promises about authentication manipulation, his guilt about Thomas Blackwell's death, which he claimed he hadn't ordered but had enabled through his financial arrangement with Richard. Marco Romano published the confession as part of the family's commitment to transparency and restitution. The Manfredi painting sold at auction 6 months after Richard's conviction. Properly attributed to Bartolomeo Manfredi, circa 1615 to 1620, contemporary follower work of exceptional quality. Christie's handled the sale with Marcus Chen, personally managing the lot. The authentication documentation prepared by Sophia was comprehensive, transparent, and became the standard for ethical attribution. Final sale price, £4.2 million, purchased by the National Gallery through Heritage Lottery funding. Now displayed in their Italian Baroque collection with wall text acknowledging Thomas Blackwell's role in determining accurate attribution and the Morrison Authentication Institute's completion of his work. The Morrison Authentication Institute opened officially 1 year after the Manfredi authentication, funded by Morrison Capital but directed independently by Sophia, staffed with experts committed to ethical examination and accurate attribution regardless of market pressure or client preferences. Their mission statement was carved in stone at the Institute entrance: truth over convenience, accuracy over assumption, integrity over expedience. In memory of Thomas Blackwell, who died defending these principles, Christie's Marcus Chen served on their advisory board. Sotheby's and Bonhams partnered with them for complex authentication projects. Major museums consulted them on attribution questions. University art history programs sent doctoral students for training in technical authentication methodology. Within 2 years, the Morrison Institute became the gold standard for ethical art authentication. Their reports were accepted without question by major auction houses. Their methodology was taught in graduate programs worldwide. Their commitment to truth over profit became the model for how authentication should be conducted. Sophia gave her first major public lecture 18 months after the Institute opened. Thomas Blackwell Memorial Lecture on Authentication Ethics at Oxford University, delivered in the same hall where Blackwell had taught courses for 30 years as a visiting scholar. Standing room only, art world professionals and academics filling every seat, students sitting in the aisles. Luca sat in the front row, listening to her explain how authentication required not just technical expertise but moral courage. How telling the truth about art meant risking threats, financial loss, professional reputation, sometimes even personal safety. How Thomas Blackwell had modeled the integrity the field desperately needed. How his death had exposed the corruption that market pressure created, when authenticity meant millions of pounds and convenient attribution could make desperate people do terrible things. After the lecture, after the questions and the networking and the students asking about internships, after the auditorium finally emptied, they walked through Oxford evening together. "You were brilliant," he said. "I was nervous." "You were brilliant and nervous. Both can be true." They'd been together officially for 18 months now, though if Sophia was honest, they'd been rebuilding their relationship for longer than that. Not the passionate intensity of Paris 7 years ago, but something deeper. Partnership built on shared purpose and hard-won trust, and the deliberate choice to try again after catastrophic failure. They'd fought about professional boundaries and personal priorities, had navigated the complicated dynamics of him funding her work while she directed it independently, had learned to separate Morrison Capital business decisions from their relationship, had figured out how to be together without either of them disappearing into the other's life. It wasn't always easy, but it was real, and real was worth the difficulty. "I've been thinking about something," Sophia said as they walked through Oxford streets toward their hotel. "The Institute is successful. We have sustainable funding, professional reputation, important work. But there's a piece missing." "What piece?" "Proactive investigation. We authenticate paintings that come to us. Families or collectors or auction houses bring us problems and we solve them. But what about paintings sitting in private collections, unexamined? Works that families don't realize might be significant. Lost masterpieces that could be discovered if someone actually looked? You want to expand the mission?" "I want to honor what we discovered. Thomas Blackwell died examining one painting. But the real problem isn't just individual authentication fraud. It's the systematic neglect of private collections. Paintings stored in family estates for centuries, never examined, potentially invaluable but unknown because no one's actually looked at them carefully." Luca was quiet for a moment, thinking through implications and logistics the way he always did. "That's ambitious, expensive, requires significant research infrastructure and relationship building with aristocratic families who might not want outsiders examining their collections. That's necessary, and Morrison Capital could fund it. Research teams tracking unexamined collections across Europe, partnerships with families who have storage rooms full of unattributed art, building a comprehensive database of potentially significant works that deserve proper examination. My father would have appreciated that vision, using resources to preserve cultural heritage rather than just profit from it, building something that matters beyond quarterly returns. I thought you didn't want to be like your father. I don't want to be manipulative like my father, don't want to treat people as strategic assets or sacrifice relationships for business advantage. But I do want to build something meaningful, something that lasts beyond profit margins and portfolio performance. The Institute does that. This expansion would do it more comprehensively. So you'll support it? I'll fund it. Whatever you need for proper implementation. Research teams, travel, authentication equipment, relationship building. And maybe, when we're old and looking back, we can say that his manipulation, the codicil, the circumstances that brought us back together, created something genuinely good. Not because manipulation is justified, but because we chose to build something better from the circumstances we were given. Sophia stopped walking, turned to face him on the Oxford street, evening light soft around them, the city ancient and beautiful, and somehow exactly right for this moment. "I love you," she said. She'd said it before, carefully and privately, testing whether the words still worked after 7 years apart and everything that had happened. But saying it here, now, after talking about the future and shared work and building something together, felt different, felt like commitment rather than just emotion. "I love you too," Luca said quietly. "Now, tell me what you need to make this expansion happen. Specific resources, timeline, personnel requirements. Let's build this properly." They spent the rest of the evening in their hotel room, Sophia sketching out ambitious plans while Luca calculated feasibility and funding structures. Partnership in action, building something that mattered, choosing to create meaning from complicated history. Later, much later, when the planning documents were set aside and Oxford night wrapped around them, Sophia thought about 7 years of separation and 3 years of rebuilding, and how some authentications took decades to complete properly. She'd authenticated the man Freddie, had exposed Richard Crane's fraud, had built an institute honoring Thomas Blackwell's integrity, had proven that truth mattered more than market value, that accuracy required courage, that ethical examination was possible even when financial pressure pushed toward convenient attribution. And she'd authenticated Luca Morrison, examined him carefully, tested his commitment, watched him choose honesty over expedience again and again, built trust through sustained proof rather than convenient assumption. Some relationships were masterworks, some were follower pieces. This one, rebuilt from failure and tested through crisis, authenticated through years of careful examination, felt genuine, valuable, worth preserving. 3 years after the Caravaggio authentication, Sophia and Luca stood together in the National Gallery, in front of the Manfredi painting. It hung in permanent display, properly lit, carefully positioned among other Italian Baroque masterworks, viewed by thousands of visitors annually who stopped to read the comprehensive wall text explaining its history and authentication. The description was thorough and honest. attributed to Bartolomeo Manfredi, contemporary follower of Caravaggio, dated approximately 1615 to 1620. Exceptional example of Caravaggisti painting, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of the master's technique. Authenticated by the Morrison Institute, with acknowledgement of Thomas Blackwell's pioneering work and commitment to accurate attribution that set the standard for ethical authentication practice. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if your father hadn't included the codicil? Sophia asked, studying the painting they'd spent months examining and authenticating. Sometimes, but wondering doesn't change what actually happened. He did include it. I did fund your work. We did find each other again through his manipulation, and we chose to build something worthwhile from circumstances we didn't choose. No regrets? I regret that it took 7 years and my father's death to bring us back together. I regret that Thomas Blackwell died pursuing truth. I regret that Richard Crane chose murder over integrity. I regret that Alessandro Romano's desperation led to such terrible consequences. Luca paused, looking at her rather than the painting. But I don't regret where we are now, do you? Sophia studied the painting one more time, Judith's face serene and terrible, holding the head of a man who'd trusted the wrong person. Violence and judgment captured in oil and canvas 400 years ago, misattributed for centuries, finally given proper recognition as exceptional follower work rather than convenient masterpiece. No regrets, she said, just gratitude for the authentication, the painting, the relationship, the life we've built, all of it properly examined, thoroughly documented, proven authentic. That's very art historian of you. It's very us. We don't accept convenient assumptions. We look carefully until we find the truth. Even when truth is complicated or uncomfortable or takes years to properly establish. They left the gallery hand in hand, walking into London afternoon light. Behind them, Judith and Holofernes remained frozen in their eternal moment of violence and judgment, properly attributed, finally recognized, proof that some truths waited centuries to be discovered, and some authentications required patience, expertise, and the courage to challenge everything assumed. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived at the Morrison Institute from a family in Florence. They had a painting in their private chapel, unexamined since the 18th century. Family legend suggested it might be significant, but the attribution label was vague. Scuola di Firenze, XVII secolo. Could the institute help authenticate it? Sophia read the description carefully, studied the attached photographs, felt the familiar intellectual pull of mystery waiting to be solved. What do you think? Luca asked, reading over her shoulder in the institute office they increasingly shared. I think it might be worth investigating. The brushwork in these photographs suggests more sophistication than generic schoolwork. The composition has psychological depth. The handling of fabric and chiaroscuro looks studied but accomplished. Could it be something significant? Won't know until we examine it properly, but yes, potentially significant, potentially exceptional. She looked at him. Want to go to Florence? With you? Always. They arrived in Florence as autumn softened the Tuscan heat, the city golden in afternoon light. The family's palazzo was in the historic center, Renaissance architecture preserved through 5 centuries, art collection accumulated across generations and never systematically catalogued. The painting hung in a private chapel, positioned where it had been placed 200 years ago and never moved since. Sophia stood in front of it with her portable lighting equipment, feeling the familiar focus that accompanied potentially important authentication. The painting showed the Annunciation, Mary, and the angel Gabriel, rendered with emotional intensity and technical sophistication that exceeded the generic attribution. Label. First impressions? Luca asked, standing back while she examined the canvas, knowing better than to interrupt her initial assessment. I think this might be the real thing, not a copy, not routine follower work, something genuinely significant. Another Caravaggio? No. Something potentially more important for art historical understanding. She adjusted the lighting, examined the brushwork more carefully. I think this might be Artemisia Gentileschi. Luca understood immediately what that would mean. Gentileschi, one of the very few documented female artists from the Baroque period, whose work was routinely misattributed to male contemporaries or dismissed as generic school painting. Finding an unknown Gentileschi would be art historical discovery of major magnitude. would expand understanding of female artistic achievement in a period when women were systematically excluded from professional recognition. "How confident are you?" he asked. "Not confident enough to make claims without comprehensive analysis, but confident enough to tell you this deserves months of systematic examination. Technical analysis, comparative study, multiple expert consultations. If I'm right, this family has an extremely valuable painting that's been sitting unrecognized in their chapel for 3 centuries. Then we do it properly, like we did the Manfredi, like Thomas Blackwell taught us." "Like Thomas Blackwell taught us," Sophia agreed. They began the authentication work that evening, setting up equipment in the chapel with the family's permission and cooperation. Careful photographic documentation under multiple lighting conditions. Systematic examination, building evidence foundation. The methodical process that would take months, but would either confirm or deny her preliminary assessment. Working together the way they had for 3 years now, partnership built on shared values and mutual respect, and the hard-won trust that came from choosing honesty over convenience again and again. Outside the palazzo, Florence continued its ancient rhythms. Inside, 2 people examined a painting that had waited 300 years to be properly seen, properly valued, properly authenticated. Some things were worth the patient investigation. Some truths required expertise and the willingness to challenge centuries of assumption. Some authentications took months of systematic analysis to establish definitive conclusions. Sophia had learned that from Thomas Blackwell's example, had built a career and an institute honoring his principles, had found partnership with someone who understood that authentication meant more than market value, that truth mattered more than convenient attribution, that integrity couldn't be compromised for profit. The work continued, the institute expanded, the authentication methodology evolved and improved, but the core remained constant, carved in stone at the institute entrance and lived out in every examination they conducted. Truth over convenience, accuracy over assumption, integrity over expedience, and 2 people who'd chosen each other carefully and deliberately after 7 years apart and 3 years rebuilding trust, working together to examine what was real and expose what was false and build something that mattered beyond profit or reputation or market manipulation. Some authentications took days, some took months, some took years of systematic examination. The authentication of their relationship was ongoing, still building evidence, still examining carefully, still proving through sustained commitment that what they'd rebuilt was genuine and valuable and worth preserving. And that was exactly right.